Hi, my name's Allie, and I am a medical student working with Wisconsin Voices for Recovery to bring you Saturday Night Chat. Saturday Night Chat is a monthly chat that creates a space for people to share their recovery journey and to show people in and seeking recovery that they are not alone and that recovery is possible. Today, we'll be hearing from Travis, and we're so excited to have him here and have him share his story with us. So, Travis, to start off, can you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you currently do, and what's important to you?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Allie. I really appreciate your time tonight. And basically, I'm a person living in recovery. I've been in recovery since 2013. My drug of choice was opiates. And at the time when I had an issue with them, I was working law enforcement. So that's what I used to do. Currently, I work for Kaya Clinic, a harm reduction clinic in Madison. I'm a peer support specialist along with recovery coach. And then I'm also a CCS service facilitator in training. So just a lot of fancy titles to say basically I help meet people where they're at and along their recovery journey, just see where I fit in and how I can best support them.
Awesome. Congratulations on 12 years of recovery now. That's incredible. And that's so cool to see too that you're involved in the community and helping other individuals that are experiencing similar things that you've been through in the past.
Yeah, thank you. I really feel like drawing on my past experiences that I can connect with people in a different way than maybe someone that hasn't had the same shared experiences. And I also feel like there's a certain level of trust there because I have walked a similar path that people just are like, okay, so you get it. And it's like I like to think that I do understand a lot of the ins and outs of recovery. However, it's so fluid and I'm always learning something new, especially working with new clients.
Yeah, absolutely. I would imagine that it's very impactful, like you said, for your clients to be able to see that someone who has had similar experiences to them is where they are now and doing so well. And I'm sure that's a source of hope for them as well.
You hit it right on the head. That's exactly it. It really is. I mean, to know that someone can go from basically absolute rock bottom and rebuild, I think it shows that resiliency is not only possible, but also if you can make that a piece of your journey and really kind of hang your hat on what it takes to recover for your specific path. Um, I think that's all so much more empowering and impactful, especially when the client's able to come to like the realization on their own and really make strides and see how their life can change living in recovery. It's rewarding to watch, but living it, I can only imagine how powerful and how much of an impact that can have on their lives.
Yeah, that I'm sure that would be a really incredible thing to get to witness on your end. And I'd love to hear more about your work in a little bit. I'd like to ask you a little bit more, kind of going back to the beginning of your recovery journey. What did it look like for you when you were first considering pursuing recovery, and what kind of led you to take those first steps in that journey?
Wow. So to be fully transparent, a lot of it was court imposed. Um, and I say that because I don't want people to think that it wasn't self-driven at the time. I didn't necessarily recognize the problem, until things really came undone in my life. Like I said, I was working law enforcement. I was actually working for UWPD at the time, in a security supervisor role. And basically, prior to that, I was doing dignitary protection for Governor Doyle and then Governor Walker when I injured my back. And that led me to going to a walk-in to see a doctor, and then I got prescribed 𝗬𝗂𝗧𝘂𝗧𝗂𝗧. At first, I didn't think I had any issue with it. From college, I knew maybe I had some substance abuse issues with alcohol, but I didn't really think twice about the oxy because I was taking it as prescribed. And before I knew it, I had developed a habit and a relationship with a drug that was extremely addicting.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I think that can be helpful for some individual or for individuals to hear, and that, like you were saying, I think um, it's not uncommon for people to start taking opioids or similar substances because they were prescribed them for their doctor for very legitimate reasons, and it kind of ends up going down this path that individuals didn't initially intend to go down.
Exactly. I think too, like I said, for me, there were warning signs in terms of like there was a mental health piece. And on top of that, I always kind of struggled with anxiety, and I would use alcohol, especially in college, as kind of that social lubricant, so to say. And then when I started taking Oxy, I realized that my anxiety piece wasn't what it once was in terms of I didn't have that feeling. I was pretty much numb for lack of a better term. And part of me really liked that numbness and staying in that kind of state. However, I didn't realize the pain and the detriment that it was causing, whether it was just not completing work responsibilities, not doing what I needed to do at home, and then eventually I started stealing to support my habit. And that's when things really came undone.
Yeah, like you mentioned with the anxiety and mental health component, I think a lot of individuals can probably relate to that and that being a component of their substance use disorder. Can you talk a little bit more about how that kind of um, interfaced with what you were experiencing at the time?
Well, yeah, definitely. I think for me personally, it was almost a form of, yes, I was taking the medication for the pain, but it was almost like I was self-medicating too for anxiety. Um, because coming from a law enforcement background, there's that machismo, there's that kind of general feeling, at least when I was in the field, that you don't really talk about your emotions. You either go to the gym, lift weights. I mean, that was another thing I was huge into was powerlifting, but it was either you find a way to deal with it and then you come to work and you do your job. And I think that's really missing a key component, especially when you're talking about dealing with people who are potentially having the worst day of their lives. And when law enforcement has to intervene, usually that's not a great thing for a lot of people. And on the flip side of that, I don't think there's enough conversation around the mental health in that field and and substance use. Um, I think a lot of it gets overlooked because the nature of the work is stressful and hard. And a lot of people just accept that it's okay to go home and have a handful of drinks or whatever it may be, or to cope as long as you're showing up the next day and doing what you need to do. And that was honestly my mentality. I thought I was putting checks in the right boxes and continuing to move forward, when in reality, everything was kind of eroding around me and I didn't see it. I was blind to it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really an important point that you bring up about the stigma, like within whether that be law enforcement or men discussing their mental health in general, or I know there are other fields as well, medicine being one of them, where it can sometimes be frowned upon or stigmatized to share that you're struggling with your mental health, even though on a day-to-day basis, like you mentioned, you're interacting with people on some of the worst days of their lives, and that can get to anyone really, especially when there aren't adequate methods in place for coping with that. So, what would you say to someone who maybe is in a similar situation to what you were in 12, 13 years ago, who maybe feels like they're not in a position where they feel comfortable sharing their mental health concerns and are maybe turning to alternative methods to kind of quell those feelings of distress in their head?
To be quite honest, I would say seek out an outside source, like a counseling, maybe like Kaya Clinic, somewhere where people meet you where you're at and really are willing to take the time to listen and understand and map out like an individual recovery plan instead of maybe something that's very cookie cutter and very like framework basic. I think it's amazing what the field has done in the last 10, 12 years since I entered, where everything seemed like it was either abstinence based or nothing. And now with the harm reduction approach, really kind of taking on its own life and the outcomes showing that it works, I think that gives people more hope, especially early on when you don't necessarily even understand what's going on in your own body. Maybe you don't get the chemical reactions, or maybe you don't understand the mental health piece, or maybe it's a little bit of both, or a combination of other factors as well. But I think sitting down with someone and having real conversations and maybe someone outside of your circles, especially if you don't feel comfortable with them, is a great thing. And there's no shame in that. I mean, I made the most strides when I was finally transparent and opened with my counselor and willing to talk about things that I didn't think I'd ever talk about with anyone, because that was how I healed, was to be able to table these things and kind of unpack it in a safe place where I felt comfortable.
That's so great to hear that you were able to have that experience and get to that point where you felt comfortable with a counselor and able to share those things that at one point felt too hard to talk about. Um, I love that you brought up how recovery is can look different for different people and that there has been this idea for a long time where it's either one end or the other, or like basically abstinence or nothing. And you mentioned harm reduction and how there's this entire spectrum in between. Can you tell people a little bit more about harm reduction and what that can look like?
Sure. So I'm relatively new to working in the field of harm reduction. However, I understand the practices of it. And basically, the way I explain it to people is it's meeting an individual where they're at and not coming in with your own expectations of what their recovery should look like, but instead having them set their expectations and say, look, I really feel like I'm struggling with whatever it may be, and then really getting to the root of the problem and say, okay, well, why do you think you're struggling with that? What what are the components here? And really just taking the time with the person instead of saying, no, you absolutely can't use these substances. It's like we want you, if you're going to use in a safe manner, as safe as it can be, and to be quite honest, to interact with other people that love and care about you and want the best outcomes for you. And that's really, I mean, harm reduction in a very simplified approach, but it's meeting the person where they're at and then building a rapport and really kind of building a treatment plan together that seems to be the best fit for them. And then I guess the other part of it too is not having an ego to say, oh, well, the way I do it works best. Well, not necessarily. And just allowing the client more or less to dictate a lot of how their journey looks because they're the ones living it.
That's really amazing to hear about. Just, yeah, hearing you talk about meeting people where they're at and kind of individualizing treatment or recovery plans to each person and seeing what their individual needs and barriers are. Because I would imagine that um, if you're contemplating or considering recovery, that kind of like you mentioned before, it can be really intimidating if you think it's an all or nothing thing. And so that's really important to be able to meet people where they're at, like you were saying.
Yeah, I think too, because like with the all or nothing, it's it's so hard to have individuals necessarily buy into, well, I'm never going to be able to do that again.
Mhm.
Never is a that's a very long time. And to say, okay, we're never gonna, I'm never gonna swear again, or I'm never gonna, is that really realistic? And I think for some people it can be. And I mean, I'm an individual that takes that approach because I know my personality and I just know that there's certain things that in life, if I do them, I'm gonna go all or nothing. That's kind of the way I'm wired. So that can be a great thing, but that can also be detrimental at times. And when you put substances in front of me, it can lead to bad outcomes. So I choose not to partake, but I also understand where someone can say, well, I have a problem with a drug that I don't have a healthy relationship with, but I've never had a problem with alcohol. So I'm going to tell that person they should never drink alcohol again. It just doesn't quite jive with me. So I would rather them set what a healthy relationship is and what that looks like with my guidance, as opposed to saying, okay, it's an absolute no.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense of kind of assessing what the needs are of each individual and letting them guide that plan going forward. I wanted to go back to something you said earlier about how at the beginning of recovery for you, it wasn't necessarily self-motivated at the time. For other individuals who might be in a similar situation where they're at the beginning of that recovery journey, but it's not necessarily coming like from within at the beginning, what advice would you have to them for people who are in that situation?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say find something that you care about more than yourself, to be quite honest. And the reason I say that is very early on in recovery, I rescued a dog. And I personally had no business bringing a dog into my life at the time. However, this dog needed abundance of support and love, and I at least had time and love to give. So, what that relationship taught me was that caring for something outside myself really gave me a sense of purpose and and direction when at the time everything else that I identified with, like a career, that fell apart.
Mhm.
Um, my educational background, which I could no longer really use because it was in law enforcement and I couldn't work in law enforcement anymore. There were a lot of things that doors that were closing, but with an animal that gives unconditional love and basically just wanted to be loved in return and be taken care of, I was able to at least fill those boxes. And then as our relationship developed and she grew more trust in me, I actually kind of gained more trust in people, and was able to kind of tell myself, well, if this animal can trust again after what she's been through, I should be able to do the same. Now, granted, it wasn't it's not apples for apples, but it's still the concept of just looking outside yourself and finding something that you really care and you can kind of hang your hat on and say, okay, well, if everything else in my life is not going well, as long as I'm still putting effort into this one thing, I'm doing something. And at the end of the day, like I like to look at small victories, like especially early on in recovery. Like if you're able to get up, take a shower, and just start your day, that's a win. That's a victory. And the people I work with all the time, I'm like, let's build on those. Let's focus on getting a few small victories this morning, and then let's build your day from there. And I find people that once they get a couple things under their belt, they approach the day with more confidence. And that helps not only with recovery journey, but that just helps with life in general.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful story about your dog. And I would imagine that for a lot of people, whether that be an animal or people in their life, that having those kind of beings outside of themselves that they can rely on for unconditional love and unconditional support is really important throughout the entire process, but I would imagine especially at the beginning. Um, are there other individuals that you have found to be particularly helpful throughout your recovery journey?
Well, I had one counselor, and I'm just going to name drop Shelly Dutch, who was amazing, is an amazing person. And she believed in me before I believed in myself. And that having someone place their be in your corner, so to say, when everything else kind of seems to be turning its back on you or not going as you would like it to, was really empowering to just have someone in my ear being like, look, you're gonna get through this and things are gonna change, but you've got to keep putting one foot in front of the other and finding at least one or two things throughout the day that keep you motivated and move you forward. And I think after you put one foot in front of the other for so long, all of a sudden you realize you cover quite the amount of distance. And that's kind of what happened with my recovery journey. It definitely didn't happen overnight, and there were hiccups along the way. But what I realized was all of a sudden I had strung together 4 or 5 years at a time. And I was like, oh my goodness, wow. Okay. And the knowledge that came from that time, I wanted to share with others. And then I wrote a book about it, about my recovery journey. And then that just opened more doors. And then I saw a place for basically a need, I should say, for especially male voices, to really kind of speak out. And I wasn't seeing many individuals with stories like mine that worked in law enforcement or were male that were open about their struggles. And I thought, well, this needs to be done. Like there's so many people that could benefit from hearing someone like myself just speak and be transparent. And that's what I wanted to give back. So that really propelled my later recovery journey. But early on, like I said, it was small victories and loving Karma the dog. So
Yeah, it sounds like those small victories, like you said, are so important, especially in the context of with your own story. You mentioned all of these things that had kind of laid the foundation for your life at the time and been priorities previously were no longer a part of your life or no longer options for you. What advice do you have for people who might find themselves at that point right now where, um, the areas of their life that had previously been like most central, whether that be work, the people they were spending time around, like where they're living, are no longer central to their life or no longer areas that they can be a part of. and how do you kind of build those new priorities in your life?
Well, I think you have to start with basic needs. Like, because if you don't have those met, it's very hard to focus on anything else. So that's where I like to start, is to make sure that there's adequate housing, that there's enough food, that there's just the very basic human survival stuff that everyone needs. And then once you have those met, then I think that's where you start building new relationships. And what I would tell people is, honestly, as hard as it is, be patient, because the work that you're putting in recovery is, think about how many years a lot of people have spent in active addiction or in a role with a substance where, like I said, like I built a relationship with the oxy. Well, just like you built that relationship in recovery, you have to build new relationships. So just being patient and trying to be open, especially if you've been hurt or if you've been misled, I think it's hard to trust people. So the biggest thing I would say is try to find at least one individual that can be your person at first that you can trust, and then slowly build out from there. Like I said, for me, it wasn't a person at first, it was an animal. And that was my starting point. That was what I felt most comfortable with. And that's really where I learned to live and love again.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Kind of focusing on building that patience, because, like you said, it takes time to build a relationship with a substance, and it'll take time to build a relationship without that substance and kind of navigate that new path forward. What recommendations do you have for people of where to look if they are seeking someone who can help support them, whether that be a counselor or resources throughout their recovery journey?
Well, I mean, I would say if the best places to look can sometimes come from other recommendations. So if you know someone that is in recovery, I mean, some of us do, some of us don't, but that may be a starting point. Podcasts, for example, can be a great source of information if you don't really necessarily want to make a call to a provider or something like that, but you want more tangible information to go off of. Um, I would say just start by being a consumer, taking different pieces in and kind of seeing what fits. And if something seems to fit well, then going with that and seeing where that leads. And also, like, that's where the patience comes in too, because a lot of the times, especially early on, things feel awkward. They're not natural, especially when you're removing a substance and then you're adding, for example, a group dynamic or something like that, or talking to people in a one-on-one. I mean, it's learning to be comfortable with the uncomfortable, and then eventually it doesn't feel uncomfortable anymore. It just feels like, oh, this is the norm. Like, this is what I do, and this is a part of who I am. Um, and I think that's kind of how a lot of individuals in recovery are able to thrive, is they build these relationships with others in recovery. They see what works for them, they see what works for others, and then there's this sense of community, and everyone kind of supports everyone else. And that's extremely powerful.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point about the importance of finding people who have gone through and are going through similar things to yourself, and seeing, like you said, what's worked for other people and finding out what can work for you. I'd love to hear more about your work as a counselor and all of your other roles at Kaya Clinic.
Okay, well, thank you. So I'm gonna caveat this by saying I've only been there for a month. Um, but basically at Kaya, what I love about it was a very soft landing when I came into the clinic. I was extremely welcomed and it felt like a real team approach. Like I didn't feel like that probably since like middle school soccer. Like it was just like, wow, everyone here really cares about not only their clients, but cares about recovery in general and harm reduction and just a group of very passionate people. Which I thought was awesome. I'm like, look, I fit right in here. This is great. And then that just empowered me to really want to dive in and see, okay, how can I help clients? So what I'm doing now is as I train for the CCS service facilitation, I'm doing what I'm most comfortable with, which is recovery coaching. And just once again, it just comes down to having open conversations with clients. The biggest thing like I can say for client success is the sooner that you can be transparent without necessarily feeling like you're disclosing too much or feeling like, okay, I don't know, you have to build the trusting relationship, but in the same sense, if someone can tell me outright, like, look, this is my goal or this is what I'm struggling with, that allows me to be able to plug and play and best help them that much faster. And that's what I love about Kaya because I'm able to once a week then take any questions I have, bring them to a staff meeting and say, hey, let's group think this. What works for other people if it's outside of something I'm comfortable with, which is so cool because instead of one mind working on a problem, you have a dozen. And it's like you just get awesome solutions, which I mean, solutions help lead to better outcomes. So overall, it's just been a really good pairing, and I'm really excited for what the future holds.
Very cool. I'm so glad to hear that you've had such a great experience there so far. And I really liked what you said too about how, even though it can feel uncomfortable, the more clients are kind of able to share with you earlier on, the better that you're able to help people and gauge what might work best for them. And I think that kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier with how it can be really uncomfortable at the beginning, but kind of learning how to be be comfortable with the uncomfortable and navigate those new situations can be a really important skill to learn.
Oh, exactly. And I think that's why it helps too, like having peers and having groups, because everyone is at a slightly different place in their journey. But being able to see people who are successful and then seeing people who are very early in their journey as well, it gives that whole spectrum. And I think being able to see that provides hope for people, especially early on when they're like, okay, well, A, B, and C did it in this group and they said this helps them. So maybe I'll try that. And to me, that's awesome because it's like, dude, the more that people are willing to try new things, it's like I look at it like this. Our best thinking when we were in active addiction probably didn't get us to where we wanted to be. Otherwise, we would not be having this conversation today. And so listening to other people who are thriving or at least making steps in their life that are in the direction they want to go, I think that really helps empower others to do the same. So I'm a big proponent of like I said, embrace the uncomfortable, hop in a group, see what works, maybe try some art therapy. I mean, just anything that is different, even though it may feel awkward, it's still building new skills and it's also giving you a chance to interact in a safe environment where you can also know that what you say is confidential and other people are going to be able to relate to what you're saying, where you may not get that outside of the clinic or outside of where you have your treatment or whatever it may be. I mean, so I think that's just extremely important.
Yeah, that's really incredible to hear about. And like you were saying, that does seem so important for individuals to be able to find spaces where they are able to share openly about what they've been going through and know that other people in the room aren't going to judge them because they've been in similar situations themselves and can relate and empathize.
Exactly. Yep. Once again, you hit it right on the head. So.
Great. Well, as we wrap up our conversation, are there things in the future that you are really looking forward to?
Oh, so there is a harm reduction conference in the Wisconsin Dells in the middle of July that I'm looking forward to for two reasons. The first is just to learn and basically network with some incredible people from across the United States that have similar ideas to my own and some ideas that I'm sure I haven't even discovered yet. The other cool part of it is I have a son that's 2.5, and he's gonna get to chill out in the water park while dad's in conference. So that's very exciting too, because I know he's gonna have a blast. So, yeah, I mean, outside of that, I'm trying to think if there's obviously the month of September being recovery month is always huge, and that's a ways off. But that's always something I look forward to. The rally at the Capitol each year is another great way to interact with other people in recovery and just like we talked about before, resources. I mean, there's a plethora of resource tables and there's no pressure. So it's basically hit up what you want to hit up and just get some. I think they do Ian's Pizza each year, get some pizza and just go from there. So that's low key. I think that's like a really chill way to interact with the recovery community and kind of like dip your toe in for the first time if you haven't done something like that.
That sounds awesome. I hope you and your son have a great time at the conference and that Recovery Awareness Month goes well. Thank you so much for sharing your story. We really appreciate it. And I'm sure that everything that you shared is going to touch someone in some capacity, and people, I'm sure, will be able to relate to many aspects of your story and get hope from it. So, we really appreciate hearing from you and you taking the time to chat with us.
Well, thank you again, and thank you for doing this. Once again, like stigma reduction and just really meeting people where they're at, I think are so important to successful recovery outcomes. So, any kind of resource like this, I think is fantastic, and I just applaud you for what you're doing. So, thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.